Welcome to All Those Kings, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Just as a quick review, we've been talking about King Saul and the demand by the Israelites for a king. Saul was anointed, and this passage that says he was 30 years old when he became king and that he reigned for 42 years, those are guesses. That's why they're in parentheses. We don't know. The 40 and the 30 are missing from any of the documents that we have, so we just don't have any validation. They've worked out the chronology and the placement of these things based upon how the history unfolded, and that's probably pretty good. Saul became king probably around 1052. The Philistines had been in the country for 100 years. They'd been attacking, and he became king at about he was a grown man. So age 30 isn't too unreasonable. And over the next 20-some years, he functioned very well as a military leader, but he disobeyed the Lord on at least 2 occasions that we know of. And Samuel said to him, because you've rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. And about that time, he went out, Samuel did, and anointed the successor to Saul, who was a young shepherd boy at the time. We would argue that he probably was 12, 13, 14 years old in that range because he fought Goliath when he was about 15. And so this is probably about 20 years after Samuel has become king, maybe 25 years. He's been rejected. He doesn't know that this has happened. He meets David on the battlefield as a young shepherd boy, and we are told that a young shepherd boy, maybe about 15 years old, was able to dispatch the Philistine champion by the name of Goliath. He did that with a sling stone. This is a sling stone. I'm going to pass this around so you can see it. This is a nodule of flint with stone around it, and they shape it to make it round, and you can... When you feel the weight of this, you'll be able to understand the reality of what happened to Goliath. He got hit with one of these at maybe 140, 150 miles an hour coming out of the sling, and he got hit in the most vulnerable portion of his body. As time passed, sling stones were modified and polished down. Rance brought this. This is from Bethsaida, and they eventually were made out of metal and polished, and they were engraved and so on. So I'll pass these 2 around, and you can take a look at them. Now, this young David, probably about 15 years old, dispatched Goliath, and I mentioned last week, this was an astonishing thing for Saul to permit. You have a champion who comes out and says, winner take all, mano a mano. If I win, you become our slaves, and they allowed a shepherd boy to go out. No one else would fight. But for Saul to even allow a shepherd boy to go out would suggest that there must have been some kind of influence from the Lord that was directing his decision. But at any rate, we are told that from that day forward, after the battle, Saul kept David with him and did not let him return to his father's house. Now, this was the practice in those days. We're told that Saul would take the most capable young men and bring them in and train them. This is really no different than what was done in medieval times. Young men would be brought in as squires to the knights, and they would be trained. They'd take care of the knight's horses and his equipment and learn to fight, and then they would be promoted up through the ranks. And that's what Saul was doing. And we're told that whatever Saul sent him to do, he did it so successfully that Saul gave him a high rank in the army. This pleased all the people and Saul's officers as well. So David was becoming a skilled warrior and becoming known to the populace. The Bible goes on to tell us that, now this would have been probably several years after the battle at Elah Valley. At that time, we are told that David was brought into the household as a shield bearer. That's kind of like a squire. That's the bottom of the line. At this point, he's a leader of men, and he's going out on these patrols, and they're fighting and killing Philistines. So this is probably several years after the Elah Valley incident, and it says when the men were returning home, after David had killed the Philistine, the women came out to meet Saul with singing and dancing. Now, they didn't have TV, they didn't have newspapers and iPads and iPhones, so knowledge of what was happening and knowledge about the various people was transmitted via singing and dancing. The women would come out and they'd sing and dance and they'd make up these poems. And David, by this time, had become a hero. The young girls loved him. He was, young, healthy, strong. He's heroic, and the girls were in love with him. And as they danced, they sang, "Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands." Now, these are not real numbers. David wasn't going out on patrol and killing 10,000 Philistines. This is an exaggeration to show the relative success of these warriors. And to say that Saul has slain thousands means he was an exceptional warrior. But what are they doing with the young David? His tens of thousands. And unfortunately, at this point, Saul has begun his descent into melancholy and depression and anger. He's been rejected by the Lord, and we're told that evil spirits come upon him. Saul was very angry. The refrain galled him. He's being compared to a younger soldier. They've credited David with tens of thousands. He thought, but me with only thousands, what more can he get but the kingdom? And from that time on, he kept a jealous eye on David. So he's beginning to worry at this point that David will become so popular that he could actually take the throne from Saul. And that happened a lot in those days. So the next day, again, an evil spirit from God came forcefully upon Saul while David was playing the harp, as he usually did. And we were told earlier that when he was having these periods of depression, somebody suggested there's a fellow out there, David, who plays the harp. This is in his household. This probably was very early after the Elah Valley. And they said, this fellow David can come and play the harp, and perhaps it will calm you. And so that process had begun, and David's playing the harp. And Saul had this moment of anger. He had a spear in his hand, and he hurled it, saying to himself, I'll pin David to the wall. But David eluded him twice. He's trying to kill him at this point. He has these moments of tremendous anger, apparently, and he makes numerous efforts to kill David. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with David but had left Saul. But all Israel and Judah loved David because he led them in their campaigns. He's become a hero. He's keeping the Philistines at bay. Now, this is kind of an interesting little interlude here. Saul said to David, here's my older daughter, Merab. I will give her to you in marriage. Now, what's that come from? Well, if we go back to the Battle of Elah, this is probably 5 or 10 years earlier when David was about 15 years old. Saul was trying to get someone to go out and fight Goliath, and nobody would go. And the king said he will give great wealth to the man who kills Goliath. He'll also give him a daughter in marriage, and perhaps most importantly, he'll exempt his father's family from taxes. Even back then, this was a big deal. And so there was a lot to be gained if you were to step up and fight Goliath, but nobody would. But he had made this promise, and so several years, we have to assume it's several years, because David was a boy, and it wasn't until he had become an accomplished warrior that this arrangement, for adulthood, that this arrangement was made. David said to Saul, who am I that I should become the king's son-in-law? In other words, I'm from a small family. We have no money. We have no name. I should not become the husband of a princess. And he declined, and it said that Merab was given in marriage to Adriel of Meholah. So that's gone. However, it comes to Saul's attention that another daughter of his, Michal, was in love with David. Young princess. He's in the household with her. Incidentally, these houses, these palaces, these central locations were very small. The rooms are 8 or 10 or 15 feet on a side, several rooms. The palace would have been a very small building. And so everybody's in fairly close contact with houses around the outside. And so this young girl, Michal, apparently has gone to her father and said, I'll take him. And when they told Saul about it, he was pleased. Now, why was he pleased? Well, he's planning things here that are not happy for David. He said, I will give her to him so that she may be a snare to him, and so that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. Now, this is not to say that Michal was plotting or involved in any kind of a scheme. What it meant was, if he's in love with Michal, I can get him to do things so that he has permission to marry her. In other words, I can use her as a snare. And what he was planning to do was to use her to entice David into doing something that was dangerous. So he said to David, now you have a second opportunity to become my son-in-law. And again, David said, do you think it's a small matter to become the king's son-in-law? I'm only a poor man and little known. Now, what that means is, in those days, anybody who married, male or female, there was a bride price that was paid. The groom's family or the groom paid money to the bride's family or bride, some kind of a dowry bride price, and this would be put into escrow so that if for some reason she became a widow or was divorced unreasonably and had no means of support, she would have money to fall back on. That's what the bride price was. It was often squandered by the bride's family, but technically you would pay a bride price, and the more important the family, the bigger the bride price. David said, I can't afford it. I can't marry her. So Saul replied to his attendants, go back and talk to David, and he said, say to him, the king wants no other price for the bride than 100 Philistine foreskins to take revenge on his enemies. Now, we need to talk about this just a little bit because this is a dominant feature all the way from the time of Abraham. David, incidentally, Saul's plan was to have David fall by the hands of the Philistines. He wanted him to go out and fight the Philistines in sufficient numbers that David would be killed. That was his plan. I wanted to make a quick mention about circumcision. First of all, it was a widespread practice. The Canaanites circumcised, the Egyptians circumcised, but it was not universally practiced except by the Israelites. So they practiced universally. The people of the Aegean did not. The Philistines are Aegean people. They are descendants of the Iliad and the Odyssey people, the Mycenaeans. They didn't circumcise, so they were the one group of people who didn't circumcise at all. Now, why would Saul say, I want 100 foreskins? He wants David to go out and kill people who might fight him back. And he is suspicious or fearful that David would go out and just kill 100 people at random and come back and claim a bride. He wanted to be absolutely certain that David was fighting Philistines. Now, how do you do that? You bring back a trophy that shows it really was a Philistine. We talked about trophies a couple of weeks ago. The Assyrians would gather heads. You kill bodies and you chop the heads off and pile them up. The Egyptians collected hands. What Saul wants is 100 foreskins. That would prove that the 100 men that were killed by David were indeed Philistines. Just as a side mention, as a sidebar here, circumcision was a very, very painful, dangerous procedure for grown men. In Leviticus, it says that the babies are circumcised at 8 days, and Jesus was circumcised at 8 days and given his name Jesus at that point. However, we have the situation, for example, when Jacob was coming back from having his interaction with his uncle Laban and acquired his wives and so forth. They came back, and his daughter Dinah was raped by the prince of Shechem, whose name was Shechem. And the brothers were angry. 2 of her brothers were angry, but Jacob agreed to take him as a son-in-law if everybody in Shechem would become circumcised. So they did that. And it says 3 days later, while the men of Shechem were still ill, still in bed, the brothers went through and were able to kill them because they couldn't defend themselves. You're talking about a sequence of men being circumcised with a flint knife, which was quite sharp, incidentally. You can make obsidian and flint make almost a razor-sharp edge, but you use it over and over again. There's no hygiene, and people became septic, and they would literally be unable to protect themselves. That happened when they crossed the Jordan before they attacked Jericho. The people coming in from the desert and the Exodus hadn't been circumcised, so they were all circumcised at Gilgal, and it says they stayed in camp while they healed. So this is a big deal, and the Philistines didn't undergo that practice. And so David went out, and it says he accepted the challenge, and he went out and he killed 200 Philistines. He said to Saul, okay, you want me to kill 100? I'll show you I'm worthy. I'll kill 200 of your enemies. And then it goes on to say he brought their foreskins and presented the full number to the king so that he might become the king's son-in-law. Not wanting to be indelicate, but I occasionally am, you have to wonder what David brought into the throne room. But at any rate, he demonstrated that he had killed 200 Philistines. And it says that Saul gave him his daughter Michal in marriage. When Saul realized that the Lord was with David and that Michal loved David, Saul became still more afraid of him, and he remained his enemy the rest of his days. And that's what we're going to talk about the rest of this morning, was the constant pursuit and attempts to kill David that ensued over the next few years. David reached a point where he finally had to flee. It became apparent that Saul was going to kill him, given the opportunity. Jonathan, who was his close friend and was the son of Saul, a full generation older, incidentally. They're probably 20, 25 years apart in age. Jonathan helped him to escape, gave him warning and helped him to escape. But what he did was he fled to a place called Nob, which is just north of Jerusalem. It was probably some kind of a cultic center that was being used by the Israelites at that time, because the priests were gathered there. Saul was in the northern portion of the hill country with the Philistines along the coast. And what David did was he fled south to a place called Nob. While he was there, he asked the priest, do you have any weapons? David's on his own at this point. He has no followers. He has no weapons, apparently. And he came down to the priest and said, do you have any weapons that I could take? And the priest said, we have one sword. It's the sword of Goliath the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah. And David said, there's none like it. Give it to me. So it's quite probable that not only did David take the head of Goliath back and bury it in Jerusalem, but he took the sword with him. The priests had it kind of as a trophy, and they gave it to him. And maybe for the rest of his military career, he was cutting down his enemies with the sword of Goliath. So anyway, he took the sword, and then he decided there's no place in Israel where he could hide. You had some small towns, but all of those people were loyal to Saul and would send word back to Saul that David's here. So he went to the Philistines. He went to Achish, king of Gath, and demanded asylum. Now, we're told that David became afraid of the Philistines and Achish down there because the other Philistine leaders didn't trust him. Remember, people had been singing all over the country about how David was killing Philistines. And then all of a sudden he comes into their camp and says, I'd like to become a Philistine. And they didn't trust him. And he was afraid that they would make an attempt on his life. So he pretended to be insane. He drooled, danced around, drew on the walls and so forth, and then finally left. In those days, there was a fear and some kind of a respect given to insane people because they thought it was a mark of favor from the gods. Some kind of they didn't want to interfere with an insane person, so he was able to pretend and then escape. So he then headed out into the central and southern parts of Israel. Let's take a look at the map here. He went from Nob to Gath, which was the northern area of the Philistine territory, and then he was able to escape from Gath. The king, Saul, incidentally, followed him to Nob. He heard he was there, and when he found out that David was gone and that the priests had helped him, he slaughtered the priests at Nob. He said, kill the priests of the Lord because they have sided with David. They knew he was fleeing, yet they did not tell me. So he killed 80 or 90 priests and the people and completely destroyed the settlement at Nob. Day after day, Saul searched for him, but God did not give David into his hands. He went and lived in the strongholds of En-Gedi. En means spring. You'll see that as E-I-N. En-Gedi is the spring of the Gedi, which is a little ibex deer. that lives in Israel. And so let's take a look at that. He was in Gath. He wandered around for a while trying to escape. At this point, men are starting to gather to him. They're beginning to come over to his side. At this point, he has perhaps 400 men with him, along with some women and children, people that are fleeing from Saul. So he has a fairly large entourage, and you can't wander around Israel with that many people without being seen and without word being sent to Saul, which is exactly what was happening. But he went to what's called the stronghold down at En-Gedi, which is on the west side of the Dead Sea, down in the rift. The walls of the rift rise up fairly steeply, and there are a lot of caves back in there, and there are a few clefts of dry riverbeds that come down out of the hill country. Here is one where if you stand right where Mr. Happy Face is and look across, this is an aerial view of that. You can see the cliffs along the west side of the Dead Sea, and the stronghold happens to be that area right there. And you can see grooves coming down from the hill country. Those are dry riverbeds. And if we look at that a little bit more closely, we find that this is a perfect place for David to hide with his men, because you can head back up. That's En-Gedi right there, that side. You can head back up in there. There's food, there's water, there's vegetation. It's a large area. You can hide men. And they were living down in there, presumably safe from Saul. If we take a look at it a little bit more closely from the ground, that's in the very back area there. I'll show you this in a moment. There's a cave, and that is traditionally, as far as tour guides are concerned, that's traditionally the cave where David and Saul had their encounter. I'll show you that in a moment. So this is En-Gedi, and if you go down onto the shore of the Dead Sea and look back up in there, you can see it is a formidable area for Saul to try to search out. And as you work back into it, it's a deep cleft. The water's down in the bottom, so you have greenery where the springs are coming out of the hillside and down into the bottom. And as you work your way back into it, you can see some people down there in the lower left corner to give you some size. And as you work back in, you have waterfalls where the water's coming down from the very back. This is one of two areas that I'm aware of in Israel that's green in the summer where you can go and get water. There's one here and there's one up in the northern area. And people come hiking and strip off their clothes. They have their swimsuits on and they step under the waterfalls. A little further back, there's a big, beautiful waterfall, and you can see some people at the base of it. It's a sizable waterfall. And then up in the very back where the cleft stops, you can see the wall there. The cave is located down there in the lower left corner. And so it's argued that maybe that's where David and Saul had their encounter. If not that spot, it was someplace similar to that. Saul took men into the cleft there at En-Gedi, and David was hiding in one of these caves. Saul stepped in to relieve himself. I love it in the Bible that they tell you exactly what's going on. They don't sanitize it. Saul has stepped in for some privacy, and while he's there, David cuts off a little corner of his robe rather than killing him. David refused to kill the Lord's anointed. And then later he holds it up and calls out to Saul and says, I could have killed you. Saul feels remorse, says, forgive me, I'm sorry, and he withdraws with his soldiers, but then later comes after him again. Incidentally, there are a couple of Gedi. They're about the size of goats. They're mountain goats, and there are little herds of these in there still today, but they're cute little things, and they'll come and pose. You have to pay them $1 for the picture, but David could have killed Saul at En-Gedi. He did not. Saul withdrew. David started his travels again, ended up down in a desert-like area closer to the Negev, the desert of Ziph. Saul had tracked him down again, and while he was lying encamped, David was able to sneak into the camp right next to Saul, pick up his spear and his water jug, and sneak back out again. The guards obviously were not doing their job, and David stood on a cliff and called down to Saul and said, I have your spear and your water jug, I could have killed you. And then he issues a challenge to Abner, the general, and said, you really didn't do your job. I got in next to the king and back out again, and so you need to be judged on that account. So at that point, David realizes he cannot escape Saul. He's been all over the country. Every little town they come to send word to Saul, hoping for a reward. And so David at this point says, one of these days I will be destroyed by the hand of Saul. The best thing I can do is go back to the land of the Philistines. Now at this point he will be accepted. It's become public knowledge, common knowledge, that Saul has been chasing him all over the country trying to kill him, and so they acknowledge David as a legitimate refugee or an individual who wants asylum, and they allow him and his 600 men, with their wives and children at that point, to come and live in the land of the Philistines. And so it says, David and the 600 men with him went over to Achish, king of Gath. And when Saul was told that David had fled to Gath, he no longer searched for him. Now, Saul could not gain access to David. He would have had to invade Philistine territory with an army. So David at least was safe at that point. And apparently Achish regarded him as a trustworthy vassal, was able to accept him on those terms. David said to Achish, he didn't want to live in the Philistine territory. There were still many people who were suspicious of him. He said, let a place be assigned to me in one of the country towns that I may live there. And so Achish said, fine, and gave him Ziklag. Keep that in mind. We'll talk about Ziklag next week. We think we have found some archaeological evidence of the location of Ziklag, a real place. It's called the Heights of David on an Egyptian engraving. So so keep that in mind. It's down to the south. It's down on the southern frontier of the Philistine territory where you have Amalekites and other enemies of the Philistines, as well as Israelite settlements. And so David was able to travel down someplace way to the south. We don't know exactly where it was, but it was a place called Ziklag. And what he did was patrol and fight and loot down in that portion of the land, fighting not only the Amalekites and the other enemies, but supposedly fighting Israelite enemies of the Philistines as well. Now, the Bible makes it very clear that he never attacked Israelite settlements. It says he lived in the Philistine territory for 1 year and 4 months. And it said he did not leave a man or woman alive to be brought to Gath, for he thought they might inform on us and say this is what David did. What he was doing was legitimately killing Amalekites and so forth, who were also enemies of the Israelites, but he would send word back to Gath, along with the loot and the tribute and so forth, that this came from Israelite towns, so that he would be regarded as a trustworthy vassal. But what he was doing was killing everybody so that nobody could send word back that it wasn't an Israelite town. The Bible makes it very clear that David was not a turncoat. He was simply trying to escape from Saul when he went to the Philistine areas. Achish trusted David, said, he'll be my servant forever. Didn't work out that way. After about 1.5 years, the Philistines gathered their forces, another major battle. We had a major battle down at Ebenezer around 1075. We had a major battle in 1052. We had a major battle in 1025, which was the Elah Valley. We're now down about 1010. We're about 15 years later. Saul has been on the throne for about 40 years, another generational battle. It seems to happen about every generation. Maybe there were new Philistine generals and they said we need to do a campaign. They gathered their forces, and Achish said to David, you and your men will accompany me in the army. This is a position of honor. He's taking an Israelite and his men and taking them with him as the major leader of the Philistines. And what they're going to do is attack a place called Mount Gilboa. The Philistines set up camp at Shunem, while Saul gathered all the Israelites and set up camp at Gilboa. Now, very quickly, what happened was Saul, up on the hill, Mount Gilboa is not a mountain, incidentally. I'll show you a picture in a moment. It's just a big mound. These valleys that they talk about, we would call them gullies in this country. I mean, everything's smaller. But Saul is located on the slopes of Gilboa looking out, and he sees this enormous Philistine army, and he's terrified, and he wants some guidance from the spirit world. He wants some guidance from the Lord. But Samuel's dead by this time, and he hasn't seen Samuel since he was rejected by the Lord prior to the anointing of David. He had done something appropriate, according to Leviticus. He had expelled mediums and spiritists from the land. So there was nobody with whom he could consult, asking for advice on how to conduct the battle. He had tried to pray. He inquired of the Lord, but the Lord didn't answer him by dreams or Urim or prophets. The prophets would respond. Sometimes you'd have dreams. We don't know what the Urim and the Thummim are. These are little devices, apparently like lots or dice. You'd throw it and look at how we don't know what they were, but they used the Urim and the Thummim from the time of Mount Sinai. So for hundreds of years, priests had been using these for guidance, and he had asked for guidance and didn't get any. Back in Numbers, I thought this was kind of interesting. Back in Numbers, when the Exodus was unfolding and Moses and Miriam and Aaron are working their way through the land, Miriam and Aaron felt that they were being shortchanged. They were brother and sister. They were Levites. They deserved as much honor and respect as Moses did. And so the Lord chastised them. He said to them, "When a prophet speaks to you, I reveal myself to him in visions. I speak to him in dreams." In other words, this is what prophets experience when they say, "The Lord told me this or that." They're having dreams and visions that aren't clear, and he points out that Moses was special. "This is not true of my servant Moses. With him I speak face to face. I speak clearly and not in riddles. You don't have to interpret what I'm saying." And it says he also sees the form of the Lord. In other words, Moses was a truly exceptional relationship with the Lord, as opposed to the prophets. And I thought that was worth looking at. Now, Saul wanted some advice, so he said to his attendants, "Find me a medium." Well, he's expelled the mediums. So he said, "There must be somebody who stayed here. I may go and inquire of her." And they said, "There's one in Endor, the witch of Endor." So he went and spoke to her, but Leviticus has already told us, do not turn to mediums or seek out spiritists, for you will be defiled by them, which is why he had expelled them from his land. And it goes on to say, anyone who does these things is detestable to the Lord. This is Saul, who's already been rejected. Samuel has died, and he needs advice, so he's going to go to the witch of Endor. And she was terrified. She wasn't supposed to be there, and he comes in, and she realizes it's the king, and he's asking her to do things that she's not supposed to do, but she accedes to his demand, and she summons up a spirit and says, "An old man wearing a robe is coming up." And Saul knew it was Samuel. And Samuel said, "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" And then he goes on to say, "The Lord will hand over both Israel and you to the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons will be with me." You're losing the battle tomorrow. Israel's losing the battle. You're going to die. Your sons are going to die. And still, Saul went back and led the battle. You have to at least admire the fact that he was willing to go back and lead his men, but he's been told that you'll die tomorrow, and that's exactly what happened. Now, at this point, the other Philistines, they're massed on the plain down below Mount Gilboa. They don't trust David. They said, "You know what? He's going to turn against us during the fighting, send him back." And Achish very unwillingly said, "Okay, you'll have to leave." And so David and his men got up early in the morning to go back to the Philistines. And the Philistines went up to Jezreel, which is a small town just adjacent, a small settlement adjacent to Mount Gilboa. The Philistines pressed hard after Saul and his sons. They killed his sons Jonathan, Abinadab, and Melchishua, and they wounded him critically. And as he was dying, he asked his shield bearer to kill him. The shield bearer refused, didn't want to kill the anointed of the Lord, so he took his own sword and fell on it. They then The Philistines then went across the Jordan Valley and attacked Israelite settlements on the other side of the valley. Those Israelites abandoned their towns and fled, and the Philistines came and occupied them. It was a total rout. A total rout. The Philistines the next day went back. They found Saul on the hillside. They cut off his head. Remember, this is the practice. And then they stripped off his armor and sent messengers throughout the land to proclaim the news that Saul had been killed. The Israelites had been defeated. And then they put his armor in the temple of the Ashtoreths in Beit Shan and fastened his body to the wall, the outside of the wall, as a demonstration of the complete victory. The men of Yabesh Gilead across the valley came through the night to Beit Shan. This would be 7, 8, 9 miles. They could have traveled across. They took his body back and they treated it with funeral ceremonies, and then had 7 days of mourning. They went to Yabesh where they burned them. Who are the people of Yabesh? That's the first town that Saul saved 40 years earlier. They were being besieged, and he went and lifted the siege, and 40 years later they still honored him. This was right after he had become king. So this is 40 years later. And it says they took their bones and buried them under a tamarisk tree at Yabesh. They fasted 7 days. So let's take a look at that. Looking north, we have the Israelite-controlled territories, and we have the Philistines along the coast, and the Philistines headed north, a huge army up to a place called Mount Gilboa. And it was there that the battle unfolded. So let's look at that a little bit more closely as we bring that up. You can see the Jordan Valley there with the Sea of Galilee and the Jordan River. Mount Gilboa is that range of hills along the side of the valley leading of the area leading down to the Jordan Valley. And the Philistines are massed off to the west there, preparing for the battle. And Endor is about 4 or 5 miles north of that area. So Saul was able to go out at night, travel to Endor, and then travel back to where the battle unfolded. And the next day, the Philistines attacked. A major battle ensued on the slopes of Mount Gilboa, and Saul and his sons were killed. As soon as they were dead, the Israelites began to flee, and the Philistines were able to travel across to the other side of the rift to Israelite territories and take control of that. Total rout, total defeat for the Israelites. Beit Shan is located right down at the base of Mount Gilboa, and that's where they nailed his body. They put his body on display there, but the people of Yabesh across the rift were able to come across at night, retrieve his body, take it down off the wall, and take it back to Yabesh where they treated it with proper funeral ceremonies. Here is Mount Gilboa. It's not an impressive hill, but the battle unfolded down below the mountain itself. This is Beit Shan, where they nailed his body. There would have been a Canaanite city up on top. All of the pillars and things that you see down below are Roman and Greek developments that happened much later. So there would have been a small town down below Beit Shan, but the fortified part of the city was up the top of the mound. And off in the distance there, you can see the Jordan Valley. If we look at that a little bit closer, you can see this long, narrow valley, the center of which is the Jordan River. And the people of Yabesh were over on that side. They came across, retrieved the body of Saul, and took it back and treated it with respect and honor. At this point, David said to the Lord, "Where shall I go?" And the Lord said, "Go to Hebron," in the area that was controlled by the tribe of Judah. And he did so, and the men of Judah came to Hebron, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah. Now, next week we'll talk about how he became king over the entire area and was honored by the folks at that point. But let's see, next week, David the king, the conquest of Jebus, that's Jerusalem, when he took that over as his capital city. We're going to talk about Bathsheba, David and Bathsheba, and we're going to talk about his dysfunctional family and all of the problems that occurred during the rest of his reign before we pick up the story of Solomon. Question.
I have two questions. Was his wife with him the whole time he was fleeing?
I'll talk about that next time. He had a wife, Michal, but when he fled, she was left behind, and Saul married her off to somebody else. And he was reunited with her later on, and we'll pick that up. But at this particular time, while he's wandering around fleeing from Saul, he acquired a couple of other wives, and Michal was married to somebody else, and David insisted that she be brought back to him after Saul was dead.
Bible Interact, uncovering the mysteries of the kingdom of God. At BibleInteract.tv, you will penetrate the scriptures of the Bible. At our store, you're just one click away from owning your favorite books, DVDs, or study guides. Earn a degree from our university and watch hundreds of video presentations from biblical scholars, archaeologists, and theologians. By subscribing to Bible Interact, you'll find all the resources you'll need, so why not subscribe today? Go to www.BibleInteract.tv. You'll be glad you did. Interested in studying more about the temple, the Messiah, or what God's plan is for our future? No problem. We've got you covered. With more than 200 DVDs, books, and workbooks, you'll find the answers you've been searching for. Bible Interact, uncovering the mysteries of the kingdom of God.